A chilling hush draped over the gym, pierced only by the steady drone of treadmills churning in the background, and the muted clang of weights dropping onto racks. She lingered near the rear of the space, her headphones slung loosely around her neck like a dormant lifeline, her breaths even and measured a snapshot of an ordinary day teetering on the edge of chaos. The air felt routine, almost comforting, until it wasn't. The glass doors swung open with a jarring creak, and a uniformed officer stepped inside, his heavy boots striking the floor with a cadence that reverberated like a storm warning. His presence wasn't accidental. It carried the weight of intent, predatory and unyielding. Though the other gym-goers seemed oblivious, lost in their own worlds of sweat and repetition. His sharp gaze sliced through the crowd, locking onto her with unnerving precision. And he advanced toward her with a stride that brooked no hesitation. The atmosphere thickened, a subtle shift she felt deep in her bones. Her instincts flared, urging her to react, but she held her ground, her posture steady as stone. "Hey," his voice boomed, slicing through the gym's low hum and the faint pulse of music leaking from nearby earbuds. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside her. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone even but edged with curiosity. His lips curled into a smirk, dripping with condescension, as if he'd already claimed victory in a contest she hadn't signed up for. "Yeah, there's a problem," he sneered. "We got a call about someone acting suspicious. Care to explain why you're here?" Her brows whereupon together, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. "Acting suspicious?" she echoed, the words tasting bitter. "You heard me," he snapped, his voice carrying a sting. "You don't look like you belong here." The accusation landed like a physical blow, sharp and personal, cutting deeper than it should have. The gym buzzed with life around the men and women of every shape and size, lifting, running, stretching, blending into the background like ghosts. Yet here she stood, singled out, her skin prickling with the heat she fought to contain. "I'm just working out, same as everyone else," she said, her voice steady but laced with defiance. He took a step closer, looming over her, his shadow swallowing the space between them. "Don't get smart with me," he growled, his tone a warning wrapped in authority. "I'm not," she shot back, her words crisp and unyielding. "But I don't owe you an explanation for existing here. I haven't done anything wrong." His eyes narrowed, glinting with something dangerous. "You think this is a debate?" His voice dropped to a menacing hiss. "Listen, sweetheart, I don't know who you think you are, but people like you don't talk back to people like me." The phrase "people like you" sank into her like shards of broken glass, jagged and searing, lodging in her chest. Around them, the gym's rhythm faltered, heads turned, eyes darted nervously toward the escalating scene. She caught the subtle shifts where some patrons edged away, their shoulders hunched as if to shrink from the tension, while others averted their gazes entirely, feigning ignorance to avoid entanglement. She knew this dance too well. Humiliation was a bitter, familiar companion, one she'd wrestled with more times than she cared to count. Drawing a slow, deliberate breath, she straightened her spine, her resolve hardening. "Are you accusing me of something?" she asked, her voice cutting through the haze. "Because if not, I'd like to get back to my workout." The officer's smirk evaporated, replaced by a shadow of something uglier, contempt twisting his features. His hand lashed out, a finger jabbing toward her chest like a loaded weapon. "You think you're untouchable. Don't touch me," she warned, her voice a low, steady blade, though her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides, knuckles whitening. "You're lucky I don't haul you in right now for resisting," he spat, his breath hot with fury. "Resisting what?" she fired back, her words sharp enough to slice through his bravado. "Your ego." That was the spark that ignited the blaze. His face contorted, a mask of animalistic rage peeling back the thin veneer of professionalism. Before she could step away, his fist flew, crashing into her face with a sickening crunch that echoed through the gym like a gunshot. She stumbled, her vision swimming as pain radiated through her skull, gasps erupting from the stunned onlookers. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than the air before a storm. "Did he just hit her?" someone muttered, the words trembling in the stillness. The officer towered over her, his chest heaving, his stance daring anyone to defy him. She was being aggressive, he barked, his voice a desperate grab for justification as he scanned the room for allies. A few nodded weakly, their agreement born of fear rather than conviction, while others turned their backs, unwilling to bear witness. She pressed a hand to her face, feeling the warm, sticky trickle of blood near her lip, the metallic taste seeping into her mouth. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. When her eyes met his again, they blazed with steel anger fused with a purpose so fierce it seemed to burn the air between them. "You're going to regret that," she said, her voice a quiet thunder, unshaken and resolute. He scoffed, a short, harsh laugh spilling from his lips. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," she replied, unflinching. He laughed again, louder this time, the sound dripping with mockery. "What are you gonna do? File a complaint? Good luck with that." He tapped the badge on his chest, his arrogance a shield he wore with pride. "This protects me. You're nobody." That word nobody echoed in her mind, a hollow taunt she let settle as she stared him down, her breathing slow and controlled. He turned his back, swaggering away, certain of his triumph as the crowd dispersed, their whispers rising like smoke. But he had no inkling of the fire he'd just lit. Tomorrow, the city would know her name and not as a faceless victim he could bury under paperwork, but as a force he'd gravely underestimated. The next day, he'd stride into his precinct, chest puffed with the smug assurance of invincibility, only to find the ground shifting beneath him. The woman he'd struck, the one he'd dismissed as powerless, was no ordinary bystander. She was Marissa Bennett, the newly appointed chief of police's first black woman to claim that title in the city's history. When the truth unraveled, when the witnesses' shaky testimonies and the gym's security footage flooded the news, his name would be splashed across every headline, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of justice. But the deeper lesson lingered in the air. Power, when abused, invites its own reckoning. Marissa had spent years climbing through a system that tried to break her, her every step a testament to resilience. Now, with the reins in her hands, she faced a choice: would she crush him as he'd tried to crush her, or would she wield her authority to teach a lesson that rippled beyond one man, striking at the heart of those who saw their badges as untouchable shields? The precinct buzzed with its usual chaos, phones trilling, printers grinding out reports, the murmur of voices weaving tales of crime and bureaucracy. Detectives hunched over cluttered desks, officers lounged in creaky chairs swapping stories, the stale scent of coffee clinging to the air like a stubborn ghost. Into this fray stepped Marissa, her heels clicking against the tile with a rhythm that demanded notice. Dressed in a crisp black pantsuit, she moved with a quiet authority, her posture unyielding, her gaze piercing. She wasn't tall, but her presence filled the room, a force shaped by years of proving herself in a world that often refused to see her. Memories flickered as she passed off her days in uniform, of the endless tests she'd faced not just as a rookie, but as a black woman in a sea of skepticism. She'd learned to let her actions roar where her voice stayed silent, and now, as chief, she carried that legacy like a blade honed sharp. "Good morning, Chief Bennett," came a soft voice, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to see Alyssa Torres, her assistant, a young woman with dark curls and a spark of quiet ambition in her eyes. Alyssa's efficiency was a comfort, her presence a reminder of the new generation Marissa hoped to guide. "Morning, Alyssa," Marissa replied, her tone warming slightly. As she continued through the precinct, the weight of her role settled over here, a shield and a target all at once. She knew the officer from the gym thought he'd won, thought his badge made him invincible. But he'd misjudged her, and soon, the city would witness the consequences of that mistake. Justice wasn't just her job. It was her promissory vow to turn every moment of humiliation into a reckoning that echoed far beyond these walls. The morning sun spilled through the precinct's wide windows, painting golden streaks across the tiled floor as Marissa Bennett stepped inside. Her heels clicked with a steady rhythm against the polished surface, each step echoing with purpose. Though her heart thrummed unevenly beneath her crisp uniform, she was no stranger to the weight of leadership she'd carried it for years, clawing her way up through a system that often seemed designed to keep her down. But today felt heavier, sharper, like a blade pressed against her ribs. Today wasn't just about being Chief Bennett, the unflappable figurehead who'd earned her title through grit and resolve. Today, she was a woman haunted by yesterday's shadows, her mind replaying the gym incident in vivid, jagged flash Officer Travis Miller's sneering face, the sting of humiliation, the ache in her lips that had faded but not disappeared. She tightened her grip on the leather strap of her bag, her knuckles paling as she fought to keep her expression neutral. Down the hall, Alyssa Carter stood waiting, her posture straight, but her eyes soft with a quiet empathy that Marissa had come to rely on. Alyssa was more than an assistant, was a steady hand in the chaos. A young woman whose sharp mind and understated grace often went unnoticed until she chose to speak. This morning, her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and she cradled a thick folder in her arms like it was a fragile thing. "Morning, Chief," she said, her voice calm but tinged with something heavier, something unspoken. "How's the chaos looking today?" Marissa asked. Forcing a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, Alyssa returned it with a small, knowing curve of her lips, handing over the folder with care. "Same as always. I've got everything organized briefing with the captains in an hour. Oh, and there's some resistance to the community initiative proposal. A few officers aren't thrilled about the extra oversight." Marissa's brow arched as she opened the folder, her fingers brushing over the crisp pages. She'd anticipated pushback. Ange was a bitter pill in a place like this, where tradition clung to the walls like damp rot. The precinct was an old beast, its corridors lined with faded photos of stern-faced men who'd ruled it decades ago, their legacy a stubborn resistance to anything new. "Noted," she murmured, her tone clipped but steady. "Anything else?" Alyssa hesitated, her gaze flickering downward for a heartbeat before meeting Marissa's again. "Yeah, the officer from the gym incident yesterday. His name's Travis Miller. I pulled together a preliminary report. It's in there, but no one's taken any steps yet. You might want to look it over yourself." The words landed like a stone in Marissa's chest, halting her stride mid-step. The gym. That incident. The memory surged forward unbidden, raw and searing. She hadn't been Chief Bennett in that momentous Marissa, a woman who'd slipped into the precinct's dimly lit gym after hours, craving the solitude of a treadmill and the burn of a good workout to shake off the day's battles. She'd worn no badge, no title, just a pair of worn sneakers and a tank top. Her guard lowered for once, and then there he was, Travis Miller looming in the doorway with his broad frame and that smug, predatory grin. He'd cornered her, his words dripping with condescension, his hands too close, his laughter a jagged edge that cut deeper than she'd let show. He hadn't known who she was, not then, and that ignorance had fueled his arrogance, his belief that he could humiliate her and walk away unscathed. Her lips twitched faintly at the memory, the ghost of pain lingering where his shove had caught her off guard. "Thank you, Alyssa," she said softly, her voice a thread of steel wrapped in silk, the non-Travis Miller code in her skull like a drumbeat, steady and relentless. She knew his type all too well. Men like Miller didn't just wear the badge, they wielded it like a scepter, a gleaming symbol of their imagined supremacy. His record was a patchwork of petty grievances, complaints of rough handling, sharp words, subtle intimidational swept under the rug by a system that preferred silence over scrutiny. He wasn't the kind to break rules outright. He danced along their edges, bold enough to leave his mark but clever enough to dodge the fallout. Yesterday, though, he'd misstepped. Marissa hadn't gone to the gym as the chief of police, gone as herself, a woman who'd earned her quiet moments, and he'd stripped that from her without a flicker of remorse. In another world, he might have twisted the story, painted her as the aggressor, her defiance as disrespect. She'd seen it happen, too often, words weaponized against those who didn't fit the mold, their voices drowned out by the clatter of authority. But this wasn't that world. This was hers, and she'd be damned if he slipped away again. Closing the folder with a soft snap, Marissa turned to Alyssa, her jaw set. "Make sure Miller's file is on my desk after the briefing." Alyssa nodded, her hazel eyes glinting with something like approval. "Yes, Mum." As Marissa continued down the hall, the air seemed to shift around her. Officers glanced her way, their nods polite, but their whispers trailing in her wake. Word of the gym had spread, rumors always did in a place like this, slithering through the cracks like smoke. Some knew the truth, others guessed. but none dared speak it aloud. The tension was a live wire, crackling just beneath the surface, and Marissa felt every spark as she walked. Across the precinct, Travis Miller lounged at his desk, his boots propped carelessly on a stack of unfiled reports. He was a hulking figuretto, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped blonde hair and a jaw so square it might have been carved from stone. His face could have been handsome, maybe, if not for the perpetual scowl that twisted it into something harder, something meaner. His fingers drummed a lazy rhythm against the scratch wood, the sound of faint irritation to the officers nearby, to his peers. Miller was tough, a word they tossed around like a badge of honor. To those beneath him, he was a storm cloud, unpredictable and oppressive. His authority a cudgel he swung with relish. His words often carried a bite, veiled as humor but sharp enough to draw blood, and he savored the unease they left behind. Now, as he scrolled through his phone, chuckling at some crude meme, he was blissfully unaware of the tide turning against him. A few desks away, Detective Marcus Green watched him with a steady, unreadable gaze. Marcus was a veteran, his salt and pepper hair a testament to decades spent navigating the precinct's murky waters. He was quiet, deliberate, the kind of man who saw everything and said little, a stark contrast to Miller's bluster. He'd heard about the gym. Of course, Miller had bragged about it over beers the night before, dismissing it as teaching some chick a lesson. Marcus had stayed silent then, nursing his drink, but his mind had churned. He'd known officers like Miller beforemen who thrived on intimidation, who mistook trembling hands for loyalty. Accountability, to them, was a personal insult, a crack in their armor they'd fight to patch over. Marcus's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. The screen lit up, briefing with Chief Bennett, 15 minutes, mandatory. He glanced at Miller, still smirking at his phone, and let out a slow, heavy breath. Trouble was brewing, thick and inevitable, and Marcus could smell it in the air. The briefing room buzzed as officers filed in, their voices a low hum of speculation. The space was stark-healing paint on the walls, rows of mismatched chairs, a single podium at the front, but today it felt charged, electric. They exchanged glances, their questions hanging unspoken. What was this about? Why did the air feel so heavy? When Marissa stepped inside, the chatter died instantly, swallowed by a silence so thick it pressed against their chests. She stood tall, her dark eyes sweeping the room, taking in every face, and defiant, some averted, all waiting. Miller sat near the middle, slouched in his chair, his smirk a crooked slash across his face. She let the quiet stretch, deliberate and heavy, until it was almost unbearable. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. Yesterday, an officer in this precinct overstepped his authority. The room shifted, a ripple of unease passing through it. Miller's smirk flickered, just for a moment, before he schooled it back into place. Marissa's gaze locked onto him, piercing and unyielding. That officer thought there'd be no consequences, she continued, her tone even but laced with a quiet fury. He thought he was untouchable. Miller's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the chair's arms, but she didn't flinch. Let me make one thing crystal clear. There are consequences. There is accountability, and no oneno one in this department is above it. The words hung there, sharp and final, as the room held its breath. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low, deliberate cadence. We're here to serve and protect, all of us, and if you can't honor that, you don't belong here. Miller's bravado cracked, a hairline fracture visible only to her, but it was enough. He didn't know it yet, but the ground beneath him was crumbling. Across the room, Marcus leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed, a faint nod of approval tugging at his lips. Alyssa stood near the door, her clipboard clutched tight, her eyes bright with a mix of pride and anticipation. The precinct was a house of cards, and Marissa had just pulled the first one free. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, casting long, jagged shadows across the precinct's entrance. Marissa's black SUV sat parked at the curb, its engine still ticking faintly as it cooled. She'd lingered there earlier, hands wrapped around the steering wheel, staring at the building she now commanded. Leadership was a mantle she'd worn for years, but today it felt like a second skin, tight, unyielding, and alive with purpose. She wasn't just here to lead. She was here to settle a score, to carve justice from a system that too often let it rot. Inside, the precinct thrummed with a restless energy. Officers moving through the halls with hushed voices and darting eyes. Her speech had ignited something, a spark of hope for some, a flare of resentment for others. The divide was stark, and men like Miller stood on the wrong side of it, their confidence a flimsy shield against the reckoning to come. In the locker room, Miller lingered after the briefing, his shirt half-buttoned, his badge catching the flicker of the overhead lights. He leaned against the dented metal lockers, staring at his reflection in a cracked mirror, his smirk more forced than before. Around him, a cluster of younger officers. Officer Cartwright among them muttered nervously near the benches. Cartwright was weary, with a mop of brown hair and a fidgety energy, his voice low but urgent. "You hear what she said? The hell out of there. Sounds like she's gunning for someone, maybe all of us." Another officer, a stocky kid with a buzz cut, chimed in. "What does she think this is, a daycare?" Miller straightened his collar, letting out a low, mocking chuckle that made the others turn. "Relax, boys," he drawled, his tone thick with condescension. "She'll make her big speech, ruffle some feathers, and when it's all over, nothing changes." "It never does." Cartwright frowned, unconvinced. "You don't know that, Miller." "They say she's..." Miller cut him off, his voice sharp with disdain. "They say. What do they know? I've been here longer than half these punks. You think she's gonna take me down?" He slammed his locker shut with a clang, the sound ringing out like a gunshot. "I've handled worse." But beneath the bravado, a thread of unease twisted in his gut. He pushed it down, burying it under layers of arrogance, refusing to let it surface. He couldn't see the storm gathering overhead, couldn't hear the distant rumble of consequences finally catching up. For Marissa, though, it was clear as day. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a promise, one she intended to keep. And for men like Miller, who'd spent years abusing the power they'd been given, the lesson was simple. No one escapes the weight of their choices forever. A shiver crawled up Detective Marcus Green's spine, prickling the nape of his neck as he stood just outside the locker room. The air felt thick, charged with something he couldn't quite name. For the first time in his long career, he faced an adversary he couldn't dismiss with a smirk or a casual shrug. It wasn't just another loudmouth or pet. He thought this was different. It gnawed at him, stoking a fire in his chest that flared into something wild and reckless. He pressed his shoulder against the chipped paint of the doorframe, his presence unnoticed by the man inside whose voice boomed with bravado. Marcus's sharp eyes caught every swaggering gesture Travis Miller made as he peacocked before his audience of fellow officers. Miller's words dripped with the kind of confidence that bordered on delusion. But Marcus's face remained a mask, stoic, unreadable, carved from years of watching men like this overestimate their own worth. He'd seen it all before, the type who confused trembling fear for admiration, who mistook their bluster for power. With a subtle shake of his head, Marcus turned away, his boots clicking faintly against the linoleum floor. He had no time for the circus, had somewhere more important to be. Across town, in a sterile conference room bathed in the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, Marissa Bennett perched at the head of a long, polished table. A fortress of meticulously organized files rose before her, each folder a silent testament to her relentless precision. Opposite her sat Marcus, his broad frame relaxed yet alert in the chair, hands clasped loosely over his stomach. A steaming mug of black coffee rested untouched on the table, its bitter aroma curling into the air between them. Marissa's voice sliced through the stillness, calm but deliberate. As she flipped open the topmost file, "Travis Miller," she said, her tone a carefully constructed wall of neutrality. "Tell me about him." Marcus tilted his head back slightly, his gaze steady as he considered the question. "He's been around a decade," he began, his voice low and measured. "One of those guys who's mastered walking the tightrope and never quite falling off, but always teetering on the edge. He's got a trail of red flags, complaints about excessive force, whispers of verbal intimidation, even a few harassment claims. Nothing ever stuck, though. Never made it to internal affairs." Marissa's brow quirked faintly. "Why not?" Marcus shrugged, the motion casual but weighted with unspoken truths. "Victims got cold feet. Witnesses conveniently forgot what they saw. You know the game." She did know too well. Marissa had spent years watching this dance play out. A maddening cycle where men like Miller slipped through the cracks, thriving in the gray spaces where rules bent and justice blurred. They never crossed the line far enough to topple over until now. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the file as she turned to another page, her jaw locking with a quiet fury she kept tightly leashed. "He didn't recognize me, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He had no idea who I was." Marcus studied her, his dark eyes searching her face for the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. "And that's what's eating at you." She met his gaze, her own sharpening like a blade honed on stone. "What's eating at me is that he didn't hesitate. To him, I wasn't a person, just a thing in his way, something to shove aside or dominate." Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing her words like a man who'd seen this truth play out 100 times. "So, what's your next move?" Marissa's eyes glinted with resolve as she snapped the file shut. "I'm thinking it's time he faced the weight of his actions." A faint smile tugged at Marcus's lips, a rare crack in his stoic facade. "Thought you might say that." The precinct buzzed with a restless energy in the days that followed, a tension that coiled tighter with every passing hour. Marissa moved through the halls like a shadow, her steps silent but purposeful, her eyes missing nothing. She watched the officers shuffle past, listened to the murmurs that trailed in their wake, and waited for the moment to strike. She called meetings that echoed through the department's stern lectures on policy, that left no room for ambiguity, hushed conversations with captains behind closed doors, and one-on-one talks with officers who either leaned into her vision or shrank from it. Some embraced the shift she promised, their faces alight with hope for a cleaner slate. Others, like Miller, festered in their silence, their resentment bubbling just beneath the surface, masked by tight-lipped smiles and curt nods that fooled no one. In the break room, Miller sprawled in a chair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as if they could shield him from the storm he felt brewing. His colleagues milled around, their voices hushed but urgent, trading rumors like contraband. Word had spread like wildfire. Chief Bennett was digging into every use-of-force complaint from the past 5 years, and Miller's name was scrawled across more than a few. Across from him sat Officer Cartwright, a weary man with a nervous tick in his jaw, his eyes darting as he leaned in. "What's she after? Huh? What's her endgame?" Miller didn't answer right away. His jaw clenched so hard the muscle twitched, his stare boring into the scratched tabletop as if it held the answers he couldn't find. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravelly. "She's looking for a fall guy. She wants to hang me out to dry. Make me the poster boy for her little crusade." Cartwright frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "Maybe if you hadn't." Miller's head snapped up, his eyes blazing as he cut him off. "Don't." The word was a whip crack, sharp and jagged, but beneath it trembled something rougher, though he'd never admit it. The walls were closing in, and he could feel it in every sidelong glance. Every officer who once chuckled at his bravado now avoiding his gaze. Every detective who'd let his antics slide now sizing him up with cold, calculating stares. The precinct held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. That moment arrived with a quiet brutality. Marissa sat alone in her office, the glow of her laptop casting stark shadows across her face. Security footage flickered on the screen, replaying the gym incident in merciless detail. She watched Miller's hulking frame loom over her, his finger jabbing the air like a weapon, his hand lashing out in a strike that sent her stumbling. The other gym-goers froze, their faces a gallery of shock and disbelief as the scene unfolded. Marissa's pulse thrummed in her ears, her blood turning to ice as she relived the humiliation, the violation of that moment, but she didn't flinch, didn't look away. This was her ammunition, the unassailable truth she'd been waiting for. The intercom buzzed, shattering her focus. Alyssa's voice crackled through, tentative but clear. "Chief, Officer Miller's here. Says you wanted to see him." Marissa drew a slow, steadying breath, grounding herself. "Send him in." The door swung open, and Miller stepped inside, his broad shoulders rigid with tension. His eyes flicked over her, a storm of defiance and wariness swirling in their depths as he tried to gauge which mask to wear, arrogant bully or contrite subordinate. "You wanted to see me, Chief?" Marissa gestured to the chair across her desk, her movements deliberate. "Take a seat, Officer Miller." He hesitated, his pride warring with the unease gnawing at him, before sinking into the chair with a grunt. "What's this about?" She folded her hands on the desk, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made him squirm. "I think you already know." His smirk faltered, a crack in his armor. "This about that gym thing, look, I told you. I handled it. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but the steel beneath it cut deep. "Is that what you call attacking a civilian in plain sight?" His jaw tightened, his bravado flaring. "She was aggressive." I wasn't. Marissa's words sliced through his excuse like a guillotine. "Because I was the woman you hit, Officer Miller." The revelation struck him like a fist to the gut, his face drained of color, his mouth gaping as he fumbled for a response that wouldn't come. For once, the man who'd built his life on bluster and intimidation was speechless, pinned under the weight of his own actions. Marissa didn't blink, didn't soften. Surprised, his voice emerged as a croak, barely audible. "I didn't know," she finished, her tone frigid. "Or didn't care." The silence that followed was a chasm, heavy and suffocating, swallowing every shred of his bravado. "I've seen the footage," she continued, her voice steady as granite. "And I've combed through your record. This time, there's no dodging it, no stories to twist." Miller sat there, a statue of shattered confidence, watching the life he'd known crumble around him. Marissa leaned forward, her eyes boring into his. "You wanted to know what accountability feels like. You're about to learn." The precinct thrummed with a palpable dread the next day, a weight that sank into every corner, every hushed conversation. Phones rang in muted tones, footsteps echoed faintly, and officers moved like ghosts, avoiding each other's eyes. A storm was coming. They could all feel it, whether they understood its shape or not. In the conference room, Marissa sat at the head of the table, her presence a quiet force, her expression as unreadable as ever. The air around her crackled with purpose, as if the walls themselves braced for what was to come. Across from her, captains, detectives, and senior officers fidgeted in their seats, their faces a tapestry of curiosity, unease, and reluctant anticipation. This wasn't just another briefing, it was a reckoning. An empty chair at the table's far end loomed like a silent accusation, its vacancy screaming louder than words. The door creaked open, and Travis Miller stepped inside, his shoulders squared as if sheer stubbornness could still armor him against the inevitable. The faint swagger that had always clung to him was dimmed, a flickering ember rather than a flame. But it hadn't vanished entirely. His eyes darted to Marissa, probing for a hint of her intentions. But she offered him nothing, just a calm, unyielding stare. "Have a seat, Officer Miller," she said, her voice even but laced with an authority that brooked no defiance. His jaw flexed, a muscle twitching under the strain, but he obeyed, lowering himself into the chair with the stiffness of a man walking to his own execution. The room held its breath, waiting for the lesson in justice to unfold, a lesson about the cost of power wielded without restraint, and the consequences that follow when the mighty finally fall. As he sank into the chair on the far side of the room, every fiber of his being pulsed with a visceral certainty this meeting had been orchestrated for him alone. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, a relentless drum roll that drowned out the faint hum of the air conditioning. He cast a quick, nervous glance around the dimly lit conference room, its stark walls and utilitarian furniture offering no comfort. The weight of every gaze, some curious, some accusing, pressed down on him like an invisible hand, pinning him in place. Marissa stood at the head of the table, her silhouette framed by the faint glow of the window blinds behind her. She let the silence linger, thick and deliberate, stretching it out until it felt like a living thing coiling around the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft yet carried the unyielding force of a judge's gavel striking wood. "Yesterday, I promised there would be accountability," she said, her words slicing through the tension with surgical precision. The room seemed to shift and Responsholders straightened, breaths caught in throats, eyes widened imperceptibly with a measured motion. She slid a manila folder across the polished table, the sound of its journey a faint, grating scrape echoed louder than it had any right to, amplified by the suffocating quiet. The name Miller glared up from the tab in bold, unforgiving typeface. Inside that folder lay a damning chronicle, Years of Officer Travis Miller's transgressions. Meticulously documented. Complaints of excessive force piled up like a stack of unpaid debts. Witness testimonies scribbled in hurried, outraged hands. And a litany of incidents that had been quietly buried beneath layers of bureaucratic apathy. Marissa's voice remained steady, each syllable honed to a razor's edge. Too many complaints. Too many second chances. Too much silence. Her tone wasn't loud, but it didn't need to bite. Carried the weight of truth, unassailable and fierce. Miller's jaw tightened, his face hardening into a mask of defiance. Beneath the table, his fists clenched until his knuckles whitened, the tension rippling up his arms. "What is this?" he snapped, his voice rough with barely contained fury. "A witch hunt?" Marissa's eyes narrowed, glinting like polished steel under the fluorescent lights. "No, Officer Miller," she replied, her words cool and deliberate. "It's accountability." The air between them crackled with unspoken challenge. Miller's chest heaved as he struggled to keep his composure. "I've been doing this job for 10 years. He shot back, his tone dripping with indignation. "You don't know what it's like out there. You sit behind a desk, safe and clean, while I'm in the trenches." Her response came swift and sharp, cutting through his bravado like a blade through paper. "Don't insult me." The room froze, the temperature seeming to drop as her words hung in the air. Miller's next retort died on his lips, his mouth half open, caught in the sudden stillness. Marissa leaned forward just enough to make her presence loom larger, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made him flinch. "I was out there," she continued, her voice low but resonant with years of buried frustration. "I worked this job for years, sires of proving myself over and over to men just like you. Men who thought they could dismiss me, intimidate me, silence me. Don't you dare tell me I don't understand, because I know exactly who you are, Officer Miller. I've seen it. I've lived it." Miller shifted in his seat, the vinyl creaking under his weight. A bead of sweat glistened at his temple, betraying the unease he tried so hard to mask. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Marissa's expression remained unyielding, her features carved from stone. She reached for the remote on the table, her movements slow and deliberate, and pressed a button. The wall-mounted screen flickered to life with a faint hum, casting a cold, bluish glow across the room. The footage that played was stark and undeniable, a brutal snapshot of reality frozen in time. It showed the gym, a cavernous space with mirrored walls and the faint clang of weights. In the background, there was Miller, his broad frame unmistakable, his finger jabbing aggressively into Marissa's personal space. Then came the Strikia's swift, vicious motion that sent her staggering backward, her balance lost for a fleeting, humiliating moment. The stunned faces of the gym patrons dotted the frame, their mouths agape, eyes wide with shock, caught mid-breath as they witnessed the unthinkable. The video looped silently, each frame a hammer blow to Miller's crumbling defenses. His face drained of color, turning ashen as the truth stared back at him from the screen. There was no escaping it, no way to spin the narrative in his favor. The evidence was raw, unfiltered, and merciless. Around the room, the other officers watched in a heavy silence, their expressions morphing from mild curiosity to stunned disbelief, then simmering into a quiet, righteous anger. When the video faded to black, Marissa turned back to Miller, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of steel. "What you see here is a man who let his ego drown out his oath to serve and protect. A man who wielded his authority like a club instead of a shield." Miller's throat worked as he tried to muster a response, his voice hoarse and strained. "I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" Marissa's tone rose for the first time, sharp and piercing, cutting him off mid-sentence. "That I was the chief of police. Would that have changed how you acted? Would it have mattered?" Miller swallowed hard, the weight of her words crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His mouth opened, then closed, his bravado evaporating under her unrelenting scrutiny. He began, but she didn't let him finish. "You didn't see me as a person," she said, her voice dropping back to a deadly calm. "You didn't care who I was because, to you, I wasn't worth respecting. That's what this is about. Miller, it's not just about me, it's about everyone you've treated this way. Every person who didn't have a badge to shield them or a title to hold you accountable. Her words landed like blows, each one stripping away another layer of his defiance. Miller's shoulders slumped, his posture collapsing under the weight of the room's collective judgment. He glanced around, desperate for an ally, but found none. The captains and detectives seated around the table stared at him with expressions ranging from weary disappointment to outright disgust. Captain Reynolds, a grizzled veteran with salt and pepper hair, shook his head slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line. Detective Lara Ortiz, usually quick with a wry comment, sat stone-faced, her dark eyes boring into Miller with quiet fury. Marissa pushed the folder closer to him, its edges brushing against his trembling fingers. "This ends today," she said, her voice resolute. Miller's head jerked up, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, cracked and fragile. Marissa rose to her feet, her presence towering over the room despite her measured calm. "What I'm going to do," she said, each word deliberate and final, "is hold you accountable. Effective immediately. You are suspended pending a full investigation into your conduct. Your badge and weapon will be surrendered, and this time, Officer Miller, you won't get to hide behind silence." He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his voice trembling with a volatile mix of anger and desperation. "You can't do this. This isn't fair. I've given everything to this Job everything." His hands shook as he gestured wildly, his face flushed with the heat of his unraveling composure. Marissa's gaze remained icy, unflinching. "You gave this job a stain it doesn't deserve," she replied, her voice cutting through his outburst like a winter wind. "You dishonored the badge you wear." The door swung open with a soft creak, and two internal affairs officers stepped inside. Their crisp uniforms and stern expressions marked them as harbingers of inevitability. Miller turned to them, his bravado cracking like thin ice underfoot. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "I'll fight this." Marissa didn't flinch. "You're welcome to try," she said, her tone devoid of sympathy. One of the IA officers extended a hand, palm up, waiting silently for Miller's badge. For a moment, Miller hesitated, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he reached for the badge pinned to his chest. His fingers fumbled as he unpinned it, the metal glinting faintly under the lights. When he placed it in the officer's hand, the weight of it leaving his chest seemed to take a piece of his identity with it hollow. "Irretrievable loss. Let's go," one of the IA officers said quietly, his voice firm but not unkind. Miller turned back to Marissa, his face a twisted mask of anger and something softer, something that might have been regret. "You'll ruin this department," he spat, his voice breaking. "No," Marissa said softly, almost tenderly. "I'll save it." The room watched in silence as Miller was escorted out, his footsteps echoing down the hallway like the tolling of a funeral bell. When the door clicked shut behind him, the silence that followed was dense and suffocating, pressing against the walls like a storm about to break. Marissa exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing as she steadied herself. She turned back to the room, her gaze sweeping over the remaining officers, some veterans with decades of service, others younger recruits still finding their footing. "This is what accountability looks like," she said, her voice firm but not harsh. "If you can't handle it, if you can't respect the oath you took, then you don't belong here. I will not tolerate corruption, abuse, or disrespect in this department." She paused, letting her words settle into the cracks of their resolve. "We can do better, and we will." No one spoke. They didn't need to. The message was clear, etched into the air like a commandment. As Marissa left the conference room, the tension lingered, thick and palpable. But beneath it flickered something else, a spark of hope, fragile but undeniable. For years, the department had been shackled by silence, weighed down by fear and unchecked power. Now, that silence had been shattered, and for Travis Miller, the reckoning had only just begun. Outside, the precinct's main corridor buzzed with hushed whispers, the sound reverberating off the scuffed linoleum floors and faded bulletin boards plastered with notices. Officers and staff milled about, their voices low but urgent, as news of Miller's departure spread like wildfire. They'd seen him escorted out, his badge surrendered, his career teetering on the edge of oblivion. For years, Miller had been a fixture in the precinct, a towering figure who walked with an air of untouchable authority. Now, that image lay in ruins, and the silence he left behind was filled with a chaotic blend of shock, vindication, and disbelief. In her office, Marissa Bennett stood by the window, gazing out at the sprawling city below. The skyline stretched endlessly before her, a jagged tapestry of glass, steel, and concrete that shimmered faintly under the afternoon sun. Her reflection stared back from the glass, composed, unflinching, but inside, a tempest churned. What had just happened was monumental, a seismic shift in a system long plagued by rot. But it wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until every last vestige of corruption was rooted out, until justice became more than a word carved into courthouse stone. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie. "Come in," she called, turning from the window. Alyssa Torres stepped inside, her usual calm demeanor frayed at the edges. She clutched a tablet in one hand, her dark eyes flickering with hesitation. "Chief," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "I thought you'd want to see this." Marissa gestured for her to sit, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" Alyssa handed her the tablet, biting her lip as she spoke. The video, it's spreading. Marissa's hand froze mid-motion, her breath catching. "What video?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Elisa's voice softened further, almost apologetic. "The gym footage. Someone leaked it. It's all over social media. News outlets are picking it up. People are talking, Chief, about you, about him, about everything." Marissa swiped the screen, and there it was, a clip of Miller's assault captured in brutal, unsparing clarity. The gym's fluorescent lights glinted off the mirrors, the confrontation unfolding in vivid detail, Miller's aggressive stance, the jab of his finger, the strike that sent her reeling. The video played on, relentless and unforgiving, a public reckoning that no amount of silence could bury. As she watched, Marissa's jaw tightened, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Miller anymore, it was about the department, about justice, about the consequences of power wielded without restraint. And as the footage looped, she knew one thing for certain: the storm was far from over. The room was suffocatingly still, the air thick with unspoken tension as the muted video played on the tablet. Every frame told a story louder than words ever could, a finger jabbing accusingly through the air, the raw aggression pulsing in the clenched fist that followed, and then the sickening thud of knuckles meeting flesh. Marissa Bennett stood frozen, her breath shallow, watching herself on the grainy footage, watching the moment she staggered back to her feet, blood streaking down her cheek like war paint. Her knees had trembled beneath her, but her spirit refused to buckle. She'd locked eyes with Travis Miller in that instant, her gaze a smoldering ember of defiance, quiet but ferocious. Her jaw tightened now as she replayed it in her mind, setting the tablet down with deliberate care, as though it might shatter under the weight of what it held. "How bad is it?" Her voice was steady, but beneath it simmered a current of dread, a fear she'd never admit aloud. She turned to Alyssa Carter, her aide and confidant, whose soft brown eyes flickered with hesitation. Alyssa stood by the window, the late afternoon light spilling over her, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor of Marissa's cluttered office. She shifted her weight, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her blazer before she spoke. "It depends on how you see it," Alyssa said, her tone cautious, as if testing the waters of Marissa's mood. "People out there, they are furious, but not at you. They're raging at the system, at the years of silence that let this fester. You're already a hero to some." Her words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Marissa let out a dry, brittle laugh, the sound sharp enough to cut through the quiet. A hero. The word felt absurd, almost mocking, as it echoed in her ears. She sank into the chair behind her desk, the leather creaking under her weight, and ran a hand through her dark hair, streaked faintly with silver from years of battles like this one. "A hero," she muttered, her voice low and tinged with bitterness. "You stood up." Alyssa pressed gently, stepping closer, her expression softening with something like admiration. "Most people can't, or won't." Marissa shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It shouldn't take someone with my rank to do it. It shouldn't take a fistfight and a viral video to force people to care." Her words were quiet, but they carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. Of countless moments when she'd bitten her tongue to keep the peace, Alyssa watched her carefully, her sharp mind already sifting through what to say next. She chose her words like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, deliberate. Maybe not, but it matters that you did. For a moment, Marissa's shoulders eased, the tension unwinding just enough for her to exhale a long, shuddering breath that seemed to pull the exhaustion from her bones. Then Alyssa's voice cut through again, softer this time, and Miller, he's talking. Marissa's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. To internal affairs, to anyone who'll listen. He's spinning it, saying this is personal, that you're targeting him because of what happened. Marissa's expression darkened, a storm brewing behind her hazel eyes. She leaned forward, her forearms resting on the desk, fingers interlocking tightly. Because I held him accountable for what he did, she said, her voice a low growl. Alyssa nodded, unfazed by the intensity radiating from her boss. That's his story. But no one's swallowing it, not after that video hit the internet. Marissa leaned back, crossing her arms over her chest, the fabric of her uniform pulling taut. He's trying to paint himself as the victim. That's not going to fly. Alyssa's phone buzzed in her pocket, a sharp vibration that broke the rhythm of their exchange. She glanced at it briefly, her brow furrowing, then looked back at Marissa with a flicker of unease. There's more. She reached into a folder on the desk, pulling out a sheaf of papers and handing them over with a careful, almost reluctant motion. It's not just about Miller anymore. Other complaints are piling up, citizens, even other officers. They're coming forward now, about him, about others. Marissa's fingers tightened around the edges of the document as her eyes scanned the lines. Names she knew jumped out at her faces from years past. Incidents she'd heard whispered about in locker rooms and break rooms, brushed off or buried under layers of paperwork and denial. Her chest tightened as the realization sank in. The dam had cracked, and the flood of truth was surging through. This is what accountability does, she murmured, more to herself than to Alyssa, her voice barely above a whisper. It drags everything into the light. Down the hall, in a starkly lit corridor lined with scuffed linoleum and faded posters about workplace conduct, Travis Miller slumped in a hard plastic chair outside the Internal Affairs office. His broad shoulders, once squared with unshakable confidence, now sagged under the weight of his unraveling world. His face was pale, the lines around his mouth deeper than they'd been that morning, etched by fear and disbelief. The two officers who'd escorted him there stood a few feet away, their expressions blank, but their eyes sharp, watching him like hawks circling prey. His usual swagger, loud bravado that had carried him through years on the force was gone, stripped away with every step he'd taken down that hall. The silence pressed in on him, deafening in its intensity, and for the first time, he felt the weight of being the one under scrutiny. Footsteps echoed in the distance, steady and purposeful, and Miller's head jerked up as Detective Marcus Green approached. Marcus was a lean man in his late 40s, his close-cropped hair graying at the temples, his dark eyes unreadable as they fixed on Miller. The two men had worked together for Yershad Coffee on late-night shifts, traded stories about busts gone wrong, but there was no warmth in Marcus's gaze now, only a cold, piercing clarity. Miller straightened slightly, his jaw clenching as he tried to summon some remnant of his old confidence. "Marcus," he said, his voice rough but striving for steadiness. "You know this is getting blown way out of proportion, right? I'm the bad guy now. After everything?" Marcus stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, and studied Miller for a long, heavy moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, cutting through the air like a blade. "You think this is about one punch, Travis?" Miller's lips tightened, his hands curling into fists on his knees. "She's making this personal." He shot back, nodding vaguely toward Marissa's office. "She's—" "No," Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp enough to make Miller flinch. "You made it personal. Every time you looked at someone, a citizen, a rookie, anyone, and saw them as less than you. Every time you bent the rules, crossed a line, and waved your badge like it was a free pass. You really think you're the victim here?" Miller's temper flared, his voice cracking as he leaned forward. "You don't get it, man. Out there, we don't have the luxury of what?" Marcus's voice rose, just enough to echo down the hall. "Of respect, of restraint. Don't you dare lecture me about what it's like out there, Travis. I've been in the thick of it, seen the chaos, the split-second calls. I've been on scenes where guys like you make everything worse. Because you think power's a blank check. Miller stared at him, his breath coming faster. But no words came. Marcus stepped closer, his tone softening but still unyielding. You let it go to your head. You stopped seeing people, just saw targets, obstacles, threats, and now it's caught up to you. That's on you, not her, not anyone else. Miller's hands shook as he looked away, his eyes darting to the floor. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he muttered, the admission slipping out like a confession he hadn't meant to make. Marcus shook his head, a faint, bitter smile tugging at his lips. Intent doesn't undo the wreckage. Travis, it never has. Later that afternoon, the precinct's briefing room buzzed with a restless energy, a low hum of murmured conversations filling the space. Officers and detectives sat shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms crisp but their faces weary, the weight of the past few days pressing down like a storm cloud. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and sweat, the overhead lights casting harsh shadows on the worn wooden tables. When Marissa stepped through the door, the chatter died instantly, a dozen pairs of eyes snapping to her. She moved to the front of the room with measured steps, her posture straight, but her expression calm, almost serene despite the chaos swirling around her. I know these last few days have been rough, she began, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the heavy silence. Rough for this department, and rough for every one of you. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, taking in the mix of reaction. Some officers fidgeted uncomfortably, their fingers tapping against their knees, while others nodded faintly, their faces tight with agreement. What happened with Officer Miller isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of something bigger, something too many of us have turned a blind eye to for far too long. But pretending it's not there doesn't make it disappear. Silence doesn't heal what's broken. Accountability does. A ripple of unease moved through the room. A young officer near the back shifted in his seat, his brow furrowed, while an older detective with graying stubble stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. Marissa pressed on, her voice gaining strength. Let me make this clear. Accountability isn't about attacking you or punishing you for doing your job. It's a commitment to this city, to the people we serve, and to ourselves. It's a promise that we'll do better, that we can do better. She paused again, letting the words settle. This badge, she said, tapping the silver star pinned to her chest, means something. It should stand for integrity, for respect, for service. And if that's not what it means to you, then you don't belong here. The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible. Some officers dropped their gazes to their hands, their fingers tracing the edges of their notebooks, while others held her stare, their expressions unreadable. Marissa let the moment linger, then softened her tone. This isn't about tearing us apart. It's about rebuilding piece by piece, something we can all take pride in. As the meeting broke, the officers filed out slowly, their footsteps heavy on the tiled floor. For some, her words had hit hard, stirring a quiet resolve. For others, they were a seed buried deep, one that might take weeks or months to sprout. Back in her office, Marissa collapsed into her chair, the weight of the day crashing over her like a wave. Her shoulders slumped, her hands resting limply in her lap as exhaustion seeped into every muscle. The road ahead loomed long and treacherous. New change was a slow, brutal grind, littered with resistance and setbacks. But as she sat there, staring out the window at the golden light spilling over the city, a flicker of something stirred in her chest. Hope. Hope that the silence was finally shattering, that this reckoning might carve a path to something better. There was no turning back now. And deep down, she didn't want to. Outside, the precinct hummed with a subdued energy. The usual clamor of ringing phones and shouted banter replaced by hushed voices and sit-along glances. Word of Miller's suspension had raced through the city, igniting headlines that screamed of corruption and justice served. Inside these walls, though, the fallout was messier, more personal. Some officers seethed, seeing it as a betrayal of their own. Others wrestled with unease, questioning years of quiet complicity. And then there were those who'd watched Miller's arrogance grow unchecked, who'd grumbled in private, but never raised a voice until now. For them, the air felt different, charged with the weight of what might come next. Marissa's phone buzzed on her desk, jolting her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. "Marcus Green," she answered, her voice steady despite the ache in her bones. "Marcus," she said, leaning back in her chair, ready for whatever he had to say. The day wasn't over yet, and neither was the fight. Chief Marcus stood in the doorway of Marissa's office, his broad shoulders filling the frame as he spoke. His voice carried its usual calm authority, but beneath it lingered a subtle tremor, a weight that hinted at something unspoken. "You should head down to the break room," he said, his dark eyes locking with hers for a moment before drifting away. "There's something you'll want to hear for yourself." Marissa, seated behind her desk, paused mid-signature, her pen hovering over a stack of reports. Her brow creased, a faint shadow of confusion crossing her sharp features. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone edged with curiosity and a flicker of unease. Marcus didn't elaborate, only tilting his head slightly. "It's better if you see it with your own eyes. Trust me on this." Marissa let out a quiet breath, the sound barely audible in the stillness of her office. She set the pen down deliberately, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper as she rose. Standing, she smoothed the crisp lines of her navy suit jacket, a habitual gesture that steadied her nerves. Her heels struck the polished tile floor with a rhythmic click as she stepped into the hallway, each sound echoing with quiet resolve. Officers lining the corridor parted instinctively as she approached, their movements subtle but telling. Some met her gaze briefly, their eyes flickering with a mix of respect and uncertainty, before looking away as if unsure how to interpret the storm brewing around her. By the time she reached the break room, the air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. Her rival anticipated like the first ripple of a coming tide. Inside, Marcus stood near the entrance, his arms folded tightly across his chest, his posture rigid yet composed. His attention was fixed on a small television perched high on the wall, its screen casting a flickering glow across the room. A scattering of officers lingered nearby, their bodies taut with tension, shoulders squared as if bracing for impact. Their eyes were riveted to the broadcast, unblinking, caught in a collective trance. Marissa followed their stares, her breath catching faintly as the scene unfolded before her. The news played live, raw footage streaming in jagged bursts, protests erupting across the city like sparks igniting dry grass. Small clusters of people gathered in the streets, their faces etched with defiance, clutching signs that bore bold, hand-scrawled messages for all and no badge above the law. The camera panned to interviews, voices trembling with a potent blend of fury, exhaustion, and hard-won hope. Marcus broke the silence, his words soft but piercing through the drone of the news anchor. "They're rallying around you," he said, his gaze still locked on the screen. Marissa's eyes narrowed as she watched a young woman appear on the broadcast, her hands trembling as she gripped a sign reading "Finally Accountability." The woman's voice quivered, not with fear, but with a fire that refused to be extinguished. "This isn't just about what happened at the gym," she said, her words spilling out in a rush. "It's about every single time someone like him walked away free, because people like us, we're too scared to say anything. She's showing us it doesn't have to stay that way." The scene shifted to an older man, his face carved with deep lines of age and struggle, standing under the gray sky. He shook his head slowly, his voice gravelly as he stared into the camera. "It shouldn't take a police chief to make justice happen, but if that's what it takes, I'll stand with her every step of the way." Marissa's jaw clenched, the weight of their words sinking into her like stones dropped into still water. These protests weren't just about Travis Miller, they were the outcry of a city burdened by years of silence, her actions now a beacon whether she'd intended them to be or not. "This is only going to grow louder," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the haze of her thoughts. He turned to face her, his expression steady but tinged with caution. "And you know as well as I do, not everyone's going to like it." Marissa met his gaze, her own eyes unwavering, a quiet storm brewing behind them. "I didn't take this job to win popularity contests, Marcus," she replied, her tone firm yet laced with a trace of weariness. "I took it to make things right." Marcus nodded, a faint flicker of pride crossing his features. "And you are," he said, his voice dropping lower. "But it's going to shove some people into tight corners. they'll push back hard. Her response came without hesitation, simple and resolute. Let them. I'm not afraid of a fight. Across town, in a stark, sterile office, Travis Miller slumped in a hard metal chair. His once confident frame diminished under the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. His shoulders hunched forward, his face pale and drawn, as if the life had been sapped from him overnight. His bloodshot eyes darted restlessly, and his hands fidgeted, gripping the table's edge until his knuckles whitened. Across from him sat two internal affairs officers, their expressions carved from stone, unreadable yet suffocating in their scrutiny. The taller of the two, a woman with angular features and piercing gray eyes, leaned forward slightly, her posture exuding quiet authority. "Officer Miller," she began, her voice cool and measured. "This investigation isn't about your years of service or your loyalty. It's about what you did." Miller's head snapped up, his voice rough and ragged as he spat back. "This is insane. Everything I've done, everything I've sacrificed for this department, and this is how you repay me?" His words hung in the air, brittle and desperate. The woman didn't flinch, her gaze unwavering. "Your record speaks for itself," she said, her tone cutting through his defiance like a blade. Miller's voice rose, cracking with frustration. "You don't get it. You sit in your cushy offices, flipping through files, but you've never seen the chaos we face out there every day. You don't know what it's like." The second officer, a stocky man with a stern jaw, leaned in, his voice sharp and unyielding. "That doesn't excuse what you did, Miller. You don't get a free pass because the job's tough." Miller's composure faltered, his words tumbling out in a broken rush. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I didn't even know who she was." The woman's eyes narrowed faintly. "That's not the point," she said, her voice softening but still firm. "It shouldn't matter who she weighs or who anyone is. You crossed a line, and this department can't shield you anymore." The fight drained from Miller's body then, his shoulders sagging as the reality crashed over him like a wave he couldn't outrun. The badge that had been his armor, his excuse, his identity, it was gone now, stripped away, leaving only the man beneath. Angry, bitter, and utterly alone, he whispered, "I just wanted respect." The woman across from him shook her head, a faint trace of pity softening her sharp features. "Respect isn't something you demand, Officer Miller," she said quietly. "It's something you earn, and you've run out of chances to prove you deserve it." Back at the precinct, Marissa moved through the hallways, her mind a churning sea of thoughts and emotions. The weight of her position pressed against her chest, heavier now than it had ever been. A mantle she'd chosen, but could never fully prepare for. She knew the protests would swell, their voices growing louder with each passing hour. She knew the backlash would come, sharp and relentless, from those who saw her as a threat to their fragile status quo. And she knew that not every officer under her command stood in her corner. Some watched her with quiet resentment, others with outright defiance. As she turned a corner, Marcus was there, waiting, his tall frame a steady presence amid the uncertainty. His face was unreadable, but his voice carried a note of urgency. "You've got another problem, Chief," he said, keeping his tone low. Words getting around that some of Miller's buddies aren't happy. They're talking quietly for now, but it's spreading. They think you're on a witch hunt, that you're taking this too far. Marissa's eyes narrowed, a spark of steel flashing in their depths. "I'm doing what has to be done," she said, her voice steady as granite. Marcus didn't waver, his calm demeanor a counterpoint to her fire. "I know that," he replied, "but you need to brace yourself. This isn't over, not by a long shot." She gave a slow nod, the resolve within her hardening like a blade tempered in flame. "It won't be over until this department becomes what it's supposed to be," she said. "If they want to fight me on that, let them try. I'll be ready." Marcus studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers as if measuring the depth of her determination. "You're putting yourself right in the line of fire, Chief," he said at last. "People are already looking for any excuse to tear you down." Her gaze held his, unflinching. "Let them try," she said simply, then turned and strode down the hall, her steps deliberate, each one a declaration of intent. Every choice she made, every stand she took, carried a cost. She knew that better than anyone. But if justice meant standing alone against the tide, she'd bear it without hesitation. Outside, the city pulsed with a restless energy, the protests swelling into a chorus of voices that refused to be ignored. What had begun as faint Stewartsville flickered like a flame against the evening sky, banners catching the wind as the tension in the air thickened. Travis Miller's downfall had ignited something vast, a reckoning that stretched far beyond one man's sins. From her office window, Marissa gazed out over the streets, the distant roar of the crowd a constant hum in her ears. She knew this fight wasn't just about justice, it was about transformation, a chance to reshape a system long corroded by power unchecked. But change, she understood, came at a steep price, and she was ready to pay it, no matter how high the cost. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere hung heavy, not with dread but with the quiet stirrings of shift. Officers moved through their duties with a new awareness, some grappling with discomfort, their loyalty tested by the upheaval, while others stepped forward with a clarity they hadn't known they possessed. The reckoning Marissa had unleashed was no longer confined to one incident, it was a tidal wave, long overdue, crashing against the foundations of everything they'd known. As the evening sky deepened, streaked with hues of orange and purple, Marissa stood alone in her office, the faint echoes of the protests drifting through the glass. A soft knock broke her reverie, and she turned, her voice steady but gentle. "Come in." Marcus stepped inside, his familiar calm a grounding force in the room. In his hand, he carried a thin folder, his expression thoughtful, almost pensive. "Chief," he said, placing the folder on her desk with care. "Miller's hearing is set. He has wrapped up their findings." Marissa nodded, her face a mask of composure, though her chest tightened faintly. "And?" she asked. Marcus met her gaze, his voice even. "He's done. The evidence is airtight. They're recommending termination. He'll never wear a badge again." A silence settled between them, thick and unspoken, as Marissa absorbed the news. It was the outcome she'd pushed for, the fruit of her relentless pursuit of accountability. Yet it brought no triumphantly, a somber, heavy finality. She'd dismantled a man's career, stripped away the shield he'd abused, but the victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the broader battle still raging. "What about the others?" she asked at last, her voice quieter now. Marcus hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the folder. "Complaints are coming in about a few more officers," he said. "Nothing as glaring as Miller's case, but enough to dig deeper. People are speaking up now, Chief. They're not afraid anymore." Marissa's eyes met his, a flicker of something pride, perhaps, or weary resolve passing between them. "That's what accountability does," she said softly. Marcus nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "It's not just about punishment," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's about showing them justice isn't a privilege for the powerful, it's a right for everyone." His words lingered, a quiet echo of the lesson she'd learned long ago. Power without consequence breeds corruption, and only the fearless can break its chains. The city outside roared on, a testament to that truth. And Marissa knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, it felt possible. Marissa stood at the edge of the bustling community center, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she absorbed the scene unfolding before her. The room buzzed with voices, some tentative, some bold, blending into a symphony of raw emotion and fragile hope. She could feel the weight of every word spoken, every glance exchanged between the people who filled the space, citizens with furrowed brows, and officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Her dark eyes flickered with a quiet intensity, her jaw set firm. She had ignited this moment, and now it was alive, pulsing with a life of its own. The victory she'd clawed her way toward wasn't a fleeting spark, it was a smoldering ember, one she intended to fan into a lasting flame. "This isn't the end, Marcus," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the room with unshakable resolve. "It's barely the beginning. If we're going to mend what's broken, if we're going to rebuild trust, we can't let this be a single triumphant note. It has to be a song that keeps playing." Marcus, standing a few steps away, tilted his head slightly, his broad shoulders relaxing as he regarded her. The lines on his face softened, a glimmer of admiration breaking through his usual guarded demeanor. He'd seen her fight, watched her push against a system that seemed immovably, and now here she was, unwavering. "You know," he said, his tone low and thoughtful, "plenty of folks bet against you. They didn't think you'd get this far, didn't think you had it in you. Marissa's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, the kind that carried the weight of every doubt she'd ever silenced. "Then they never really knew me," she replied, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fire. She turned her gaze back to the room, her mind racing with the stakes of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about Hair, it was about the countless faces she'd never see, the voices she'd never hear, all depending on her to keep pushing forward. Justice wasn't a trophy to display, it was a promise to uphold, a lesson carved into the fabric of every step she took. Meanwhile, across town, Travis Miller slumped in the dim glow of his barren apartment, the air thick with a silence that pressed against his chest like a vice. The walls, once a backdrop to his swaggering confidence, now loomed inward, shrinking the space around him until it felt like a cage. In his trembling hands, he clutched a crumpled letter, its stark black ink spelling out his unraveling termination. The words swam before his bleary eyes, taunting him with their finality. For years, that badge had been his shield, his crown, a symbol of power that made him untouchable, invincible. Now it was gone, stripped away like a threadbare cloak, leaving him exposed and shivering in the wreckage of his own making. He dropped the letter onto the scarred coffee table, his fingers twitching as if they could still grasp the authority he'd lost. His mind churned, desperate to pin the blame elsewhere: Marissa, the system, the world. But the truth gnawed at him, relentless and sharp. This wasn't a single misstep, it was a reckoning, a tidal wave of consequences crashing over years of shortcuts, lies, and abuses he'd buried beneath his uniform. He'd wielded power like a blunt weapon, never pausing to consider the lives he'd bruised, the trust he'd shattered. Now, all that remained was the man staring back at him from the cracked mirror across the room, a hollow shell stripped bare. A sharp knock jolted him from his spiraling thoughts, his pulse hammering in his ears. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob, dread pooling in his gut. When he finally swung the door open, there stood Marcus Green, the detective's steady gaze piercing through the gloom. Marcus held a thick folder under one arm, his posture relaxed, but his presence commanding. "Miller," he said, his voice even, betraying no hint of malice. Travis's throat tightened, his words coming out rough and brittle. "What do you want?" Marcus stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes sweeping over the sparse room, the flickering bulb overhead, the threadbare couch, the empty beer cans scattered like fallen soldiers. He turned to face Miller, holding out the folder with deliberate calm. "I'm not here to rub it in," Marcus said, his tone firm yet tinged with something softer, almost like pity. "I'm here because you've got a choice to make." Travis's brow creased, suspicion flickering in his bloodshot eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" Marcus pressed the folder into Travis's reluctant hands. "These are names," he explained, his voice cutting through the stifling air. "People who stepped forward after everything went down. People you let down. People who trusted you to protect them and got betrayal instead. You want a shot at fixing this? Start here. Start by owning up to what you've done." Travis stared at the folder, its weight searing his palms like a brand. His breath hitched, a storm of defiance and shame warring within him. "Why would I do that?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. "Because you've got nothing left to lose, Travis. You've torched every bridge, every scrap of respect you ever had. The only way out of this hole is to face the truth. You might never get back what you had, but you can stop being the man who hides from it. It's your call." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Travis's face cracked, just for a moment, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through his hardened mask. Marcus didn't wait for an answer. He turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Travis alone with the folder and the ghosts of his past. A week later, the city wore a different skin. The protests that had once roared through the streets had quieted, their echoes replaced by a tentative stillness, a cautious hope threading through the air. At the community center, chairs scraped against the worn wooden floor as people gathered, ordinary citizens, shoulder to shoulder with uniformed officers, their faces a mosaic of wariness and curiosity. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, the late afternoon light streaming through dusty windows to cast long shadows across the crowd. Conversations stumbled at first, halting and awkward, but slowly they gained momentum, words of anger, of grief, of hesitant understanding weaving a fragile tapestry. Marissa lingered near the back, her posture rigid, her heart thudding with a mix of pride and trepidation. She watched a young woman with braided hair lean forward, her voice trembling as she spoke to an officer who nodded slowly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Nearby, an older man with weathered hands gestured animatedly, his story spilling out in bursts while a female officer listened, her expression shifting from defensiveness to quiet reflection. This was no grand reconciliation yet, but it was a crack in the wall, a sliver of light piercing the divide. Marcus joined her, his footsteps soft against the creaking floor. "Quite a picture, huh?" he murmured, his voice warm with understated awe. Marissa nodded, her eyes never leaving the scene. "It's a start," she said, her tone measured but brimming with determination. "People are going to remember this, Marissa," Marcus added, his words carrying a quiet weight. "You could have swept that footage under the rug, let it fade into nothing, but you didn't." She turned to him then, her gaze fierce yet tender. "It was never about me, Marcus. It was about them, the ones who've been silenced, the ones who've begged for justice and gotten nothing but empty hands. This is their story, their fight." Marcus's lips twitched into a faint smile, a rare crack in his stoic facade. "Well, you've given them something to hold onto, something to believe in." Marissa glanced back at the room, her chest swelling with a bittersweet ache. "It's not about believing in me," she said softly. "It's about believing that change can happen, that holding people accountable isn't a punishment. It's a foundation, a promise we owe to each other." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, Marissa returned to her small office. The city's heartbeat thrummed faintly through the open window, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional wail of a siren. She sank into her chair, the worn leather creaking beneath her, and let her shoulders relax for the first time that day. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a sharp interruption to the quiet. She picked it up, her eyes narrowing as she read the headline flashing across the screen. "Chief of Police sparks change, a city rallies for accountability." A slow breath escaped her lips as she set the phone down, leaning back to stare at the ceiling. The fight was far from over. There would be pushback, setbacks, days when the weight of it all threatened to crush her. But tonight, she felt the tide shifting. The silence she'd shattered wasn't empty anymore. It was alive with voice demanding, questioning, rising. And in that chorus, she found not just purpose, but a reminder: justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above. It was a fire stoked by those brave enough to confront power, to face its consequences, and to demand better. Travis's fall was a lesson etched in shadow, a warning that authority unchecked breeds ruin. And this fragile bridge she'd helped build, it was proof that from those ashes, something stronger could rise.